What I want to talk about today are two articles by Bradley Kuhn from the Software Freedom Conservancy. This is the Conservancy blog. The first one this is from 2022, so this is a little bit perhaps dated, but it'll be interesting to see kind of what they have to say and how that relates to what's going on today. So the title of this is If Software is My Co-Pilot, Who Programmed My Software? So this is thinking about open source, and in this case, Microsoft's Copilot, and how that kind of works together. So we start with software freedom as our goal. Copyleft is a strategy to reach that goal. So copyleft, of course, is the sort of philosophy behind the open source licenses that we use today. So the MIT license or some other license like Apache or something like that. Also, if you use Creative Commons licenses, that's also something called the philosophy behind that is called copyleft. And copyleft is the opposite of copyright. So copyright is where you put a mark on something and you protect the intellectual property of that thing. And it's explicitly against making copies of something or utilizing something for purposes of remixing it or something like that. Copyleft actually takes a different approach. And copyleft stresses the notion of sort of the basic product, the basic framework of the product, and encourages people to remix the work for their own use, and encourages sort of people who adopt these licenses to build on sort of a base license. So for example, you might have a Creative Commons license that's very basic in saying this work, you have to do certain things if you adopt this work to satisfy the requirements of the license. And so those things might be you can't use it for commercial purposes, you can't use it for other types of purposes. You must attribute the people who created the work and these sorts of things. So it basically gives the sort of the person who created the content or the software freedom to say what people can and can't use the work for. So this is the idea here is that you have software freedom. And last week we talked about free software or the Free Software Foundation. And when they say free software, this is what they mean. They mean software freedom, the freedom to use software, or the freedom to sort of manage the intellectual property of that software in a way that doesn't get in the way of the open source productivity model. So this is a statement right out of the box that this is our goal, to have software freedom in the form of copyleft licensing and that sort of governance. That tenet is often forgotten by activists. Copyleft is even abused to advance proprietary goals. We too often see concern about this future of copyleft overshadow the necessary fundamental question. Does a particular behavior or trend and the inevitable outcomes of those behaviors and trends increase or decrease users' rights to copy, share, modify, reinstall modified versions of their software? That question remains paramount as we face new challenges. So this is interesting. Copyleft is even abused to advance proprietary goals. So copyleft allows great freedom to the end user of some product to modify the product or to use it as they see fit. And so sometimes, corporations or entities will try to use open source products and sort of enclose it in a proprietary way. Or sometimes there will be a mix of copyleft licensing and then proprietary, proprietary organizational goals. And so these are kinds of, this is something that needs to be balanced out. Sometimes this comes into conflict where, maybe one project that's a fork wants to do something that's proprietary and the main project does not, or it could be the other way around. And so that comes into conflict more often than we'd like. So, introduced first by Microsoft's GitHub in their Copilot product, computer-assisted software authorship by way of machine learning models presents a formidable challenge to software freedom's future. So we talked about how this, presents a challenge to maintainers, it presents a challenge to organizations, but it does present a challenge to the whole open source productivity model. And there are different ways in which these challenges happen, but basically, we have large corporations with these models, and then people use the models in like say an open source context, and especially now that we have this intersection of Copilot and GitHub, where we might host our work on GitHub, and Copilot is sort of integrated into that, and there's this imperative by Microsoft to sort of fully integrate GitHub with the sorts of activities that involves Copilot. So using repositories as training data, and then integrating Copilot in a way that doesn't necessarily match the terms and conditions of a copyleft license. Yet we can in fact imagine a software freedom utopia that embodies this technology. So we talked about open source models last week, and that might be one possibility, but they're kind of going in a different direction here. Imagine that all software authors have access to the global archive of machine learning models, and that they are fully reproducible. So this is a sort of a hypothetical situation. Everyone has equal rights to fork those models and train them further with their own data sets, provided that they must release new models and input code freely into the global archive. All code produced by these models is also made freely available under copyleft. All code that builds the models, all historical input sets, and all trained models are also made available to everyone under copyleft licenses. So this is the sort of the copyleft vision of using AI models and how that would fit directly in to the vision of software freedom and open source. Now we talked about open source models, and of course, those kind of conform to this vision. But then, of course, you have proprietary models, and it's a very different imperative. So, there is this tension there. And, the question is, there are a lot of questions here. The first is, could you have data sets that are fully open source? That is, could you derive your own data set where, there are no sort of connections to anyone else's intellectual property rights, or there's you can do this at scale in a way that is viable as an open source thing. And so this is where we kind of get into this realm of perhaps large AI models require proprietary organization to implement and to distribute them. But as we've seen with some of these open source large language models, perhaps not. Perhaps we can do this in sort of the way that more in the way of this vision. While activists might quibble about minor details to optimize imagined utopia, this thought experiment shows computer-assisted software authorship does not inherently negate software freedom. Rather, the rules, requirements, and policies that apply will determine whether software freedom is respected. To paraphrase Hamlet, there's nothing either good or bad, but the policy makes it so. So, according to this vision, this is, the idea is basically the policy or the governance of the organization is going to make a difference. Okay, so then this next section, obviously ignoring machine learning for computer-assisted software authorship will not usher in the software freedom utopia. Copyleft activists cannot stand idly by in this situation, but we must temper our attention by considering the likelihood of dystopian and problematic outcomes and the options available to prevent them. In response to Copilot's announcement, pundits speculated without evidence a prevailing feeling of free software had a good run, but I guess that's over now. Such predictions seem consistent with the well-documented over-optimism of artificial intelligence's success. The rapid replacement of traditional software development methodologies seem unlikely, however. As such, we should not overestimate the likelihood that these new systems will both accelerate proprietary software development, while we simultaneously fail to prevent copylefted software from enabling that activity. The former may not come to pass, so we should not unduly fret about the latter, lest we misdirect resources. In short, AI is usually slow-moving and produces incremental change far more often than it produces radical change. The problem is thus not imminent, nor the damage irreversible. However, we must respond deliberately with all due celerity and begin that work immediately. So basically, this is an interesting part here. We should not overestimate the likelihood that these new systems will both accelerate proprietary software development while simultaneously failing to prevent copylefted software from enabling that activity. So that's a little confusing to me. I don't know why, but it's basically the idea that proprietary software development will come at the expense of open source development for reasons involving the proprietary nature of very large language models. And of course, we had this conversation last week about how there are open source models that are closing the gap. But I think this characterizes, especially back in 2022, this sort of, how people were feeling about this, and how people were thinking about, this phenomena as a threat to open source development. On the other hand, this person, the author, points out that these changes that you'll see in productivity and in the mode of production of software is not likely to be changed very radically. It's likely to be changed incrementally, or things will balance themselves out. So this is a little bit more about some of these things going on. And so this was all based on when Copilot announced that they would be sort of become integrated with GitHub. So this is the whole sort of context behind this article. So it points out here, currently there are two factors that influence the timing of our response. So the first is that if GitHub's Copilot becomes a non-beta product available to the programming public, that would indicate necessity of an urgent response. Microsoft and GitHub are unlikely to share their product plans, so we cannot know for sure when this will occur. However, in the 7 months since the first beta was made available, we consistently heard anecdotally that more and more developers, particularly FOSS developers, had received beta invitations. Based on these facts, we must assume that a move from private beta to public deployment is imminent in 2022. So they view this as sort of an urgent problem. And of course, it's already happened to us now. So, Second, we already know that some of our worst fears are definitely true. Namely, that Microsoft and GitHub use copylefted software as part of Copilot's training set. So this was part of the angst here, is that they're using copylefted software as sort of in the training set of Copilot, and then Copilot would turn around and author software that would then not be copyleft. Copilot was trained on billions of lines of public code written by others. While GitHub has refused requests to release even a list of repositories included in the training set, use of the word public indicates that only software with source available licenses, even if not FOSS licenses, were inputted into Copilot. Furthermore, GitHub admits that during training, the system encountered a copy of the GPL more than 700,000 times. This effectively confirms that copylefted public code appears in the training set. So this is interesting. And so The secrecy and non-cooperativeness is expected from a proprietary software company and its subsidiary, but leaves us only with speculative conclusions to inform a strategy for copyleft here. We can reliably guess that the companies will claim fair use as their primary justification for creating the model and offering the service, and will argue that both the output and trained model are not works based on the program, which is GPL version 2, nor do they copy from or adapt all or part of the works in a fashion requiring copyright permission, which is GPL version 3. So these are like excerpts from the GPL license and how, a large proprietary corporation is kind of arguing its way around it. Furthermore, we can reliably conclude, given the continuing product promotion, that the companies have at least a medium-term commitment to Copilot. So this gets into this issue of, training a model on things that have copyright protections or sometimes copyleft protections. So we are, I think, more familiar with the copyright case, where you might have something that is like a work that was a book at some point, and it's been used, it's been maybe accessed by the model and included into the training set, and then the idea is that the book is usually sold and the royalties go to the author, and in this case none of that is the case. And in any case, using some book or something like that in this way creates a situation where it goes outside the conventional royalty scheme. So, there's some violation of the copyright law there. With copyleft, it's a little harder to understand what the remedy is there, because you're obviously violating, or maybe not obviously, violating the terms of the copyleft license, but it's not quite clear what the remedy is. So this is kind of what the angst is in this article. And they kind of go through and talk a little bit about it, and thinking exactly about what the responsibility of someone is who uses, say, a repository to train their model with. What should, do they need to follow the letter of the law in terms of the copyleft license, or is there some sort of ambiguity there? And maybe we need to change our copyleft licensing strategy a bit. But this is the thing. So there's this part here: Copilot leaves copyleft compliance as an exercise for the user, which is of course not necessarily a legally sound strategy. Users likely face growing liability that only increases as Copilot improves. Users currently have no methods besides serendipity and educated guesses to know whether Copilot's output is copyrighted by someone else or copylefted by someone else. Proprietary software companies such as Synopsys provide so-called scanning tools that can search your proprietary code base and find hidden copylefted software. So there are ways to sort of find the source of the code and attribute it properly. However, the FOSS tools for that job are in their infancy and unlikely to develop quickly, since historically those who want those tools are companies that primarily develop proprietary software and seek to avoid copylefted software. So this is just kind of their perspective here is to simply avoid Copilot to get around these potential infringements. So that's one article I wanted to cover, and hopefully we can talk about it a little bit later here. This next article is from the same blog, and this is recommendations when using large language model-backed generative AI systems for FOSS contributions. So this is, I'm not sure what the date is on this, but this is just kind of a set of recommendations that they've published. So this is post that article, at least 2024, because they mention here in 2024. Actually, they mentioned the original article here. So this is kind of following up on this. And these are the recommendations. And this is, again, the Software Freedom Conservancy. So it's some sort of special interest organization that's advocating for software freedom. So the entire community of computer users, which quickly approaches every human, faces the growing conundrum of generative artificial intelligence systems backed by large language models. Software freedom activists face particularly difficult challenges in this regard. These large language model Gen AI systems have been applied in earnest to the endeavors of software creation and modification. We cannot sufficiently mitigate this tricky problem with merely one statement or a few blog posts. So in 2022, this article that we just covered was published. In the last year, that journey grew into complexity and urgency when some of SFC's member projects and supporters began to regularly request moral and ethical guidance on these matters. SFE spent these months in almost daily internal discussions about the plethora of dilemmas presented by LLM generative AI systems. Now, in 2024, SFC published an aspirational statement, which is here. This is an aspirational statement on large language model generative AI programming, which was actually more of a thought experiment rather than a definition. So this is more of a definition. This article here, this article links to, is more of the aspiration. So we now make urgent recommendations to those ordered by their employees to use large language models, generative AI code assistants, to contribute to free and open source software. Of course, that doesn't mean that you're forced to do it, but there is this, there is this conundrum that people want guidance on. Some FOSS project leaders have taken a zero tolerance approach to any kind of AI contributions to their projects. We support leaders who make such decisions. FOSS project leaders deserve our sympathy and understanding regarding the voluminous onslaught of new contributions. Patch evaluation has always required careful analysis because humans can write bad code, machines can write bad code, and you need to be able to have these checks in the pull request acceptance process. Now, that analysis demand reasonably feels daunting to maintainers, and everyone should respect their decision. Nevertheless, we cannot and must not ignore the many FOSS contributors who decide to explore these tools for the betterment of FOSS. Software freedom activism only succeeds when we admit that we are at least decades away from universal software freedom. Proprietary systems will continue to exist, and there is a real danger they will continue to leapfrog FOSS. We should resist the use of proprietary systems, which include the most popular large language model AI systems, but we should also remain willing, as we always have, to utilize such systems when they can advance software freedom. And so this is just kind of getting into what they recommend. So they have 14 recommendations. So I'll just go through these quickly, and then we can have a discussion about this. So the most important ones are first, and then they go down in terms of priority. So the first is the FOSS community should support, not just tolerate, those who outright reject large language model AI systems. Okay, so that's like, it's kind of like a religious exemption almost, where, people have their reasons for not using it, and you shouldn't force people to use something. I don't know in the FOSS community if that's a common practice. It seems more common in the corporate world. But in any case, that's number one. Number two is every FOSS contributor deserves self-determination regarding large language model AI. So no one should be required to use those systems under duress. So the first two recommendations are about sort of forced use or compulsory use. Number three is that FOSS projects should not shun contributors who choose to use large language model AI systems. So they should be kind of treated in the same way, and they should be given equal consideration. Such contributions should be treated no differently than a technically inadequate first patch. Some submitters should be welcomed to the community and receive a gentle, albeit perhaps firm language response, thanking them for their interest and explaining gently why the project will not accept their contribution. So I don't know, I guess there's a bias there, although You're not supposed to shun contributors. In any case, before submission, FOSS contributors must invest substantial time reviewing AI-assisted and or generated contributions. So this means that the contributions need curation, and contributors should acquire an in-depth understanding of their contribution. Being able to engage with human contributors and humans, kind of understanding what a model is providing in terms of insight or in terms of code is essential. Number 5, full disclosure on how and when large language models, generative AI systems were utilized to assist in the creation of a contribution is a moral imperative. So this is again with transparency and sort of interpretability. Number 6, contributors should only submit unattended AI contributions in an area explicitly designated for such. If none exists, such contributions should be assumed unwelcome. So I don't know what they mean by unattended. I guess that's where they don't want to waste too much of the maintainer's time in these kinds of projects and going over these kinds of pull requests. Maintainers' time is precious and is best used in human-to-human interactions with new and existing human contributors. Maintainers should think carefully about the types of unintended large language model AI contributions that may be useful. We encourage project leaders to flexibly and regularly, but also slowly and deliberately, consider policy changes on unattended contributions when new contributors present new ideas. Number 7, generative AI users should keep detailed and accurate records of their interaction and save those meta artifacts for posterity, so like logs, prompts, and notes. 8 is avoid jumping to conclusions about the legal significance of generated contributions, whether they are copyright washing machines that ruin copyleft. That's interesting. This means that you don't want to have a bunch of copyrighted material in the model that then creates code that you commit to a repository that's licensed in a copyleft way. So it's just kind of separating out the copyright from the copyleft. And now everything, because of the technology you're using to generate code, everything gets swept up and dumped into the copyleft ecosystem. It's an interesting point, and I don't know what the answer is there, or even if that's really a valid concern, but we can talk about that. Number 9, inputs impact the licensing of the artifacts. So again, when you have an input that's maybe copyrighted, can you even accept it into a copyleft environment? Number 10 is copyleft everything remains the best viable and safest approach. So everything should be copyleft. So there shouldn't be any sort of mixing of code, but also that everything in a repository should be licensed as copyleft. So we can't have contributions to a project that is licensed under copyleft to be sort of copyright. So everything has to be copyleft, and everything also has to conform to that license. So this is, just a licensing issue, but it's important, I think, because a lot of times, we're not aware of how what we create interacts with the governance and the licensing strategies that our organizations use. And so they're very much against proprietary tools. They don't recommend them, but sometimes you have to use proprietary tools. And so that leads us to number 11, when AI systems, including proprietary ones, can massively accelerate FOSS improvements. Use of such tools is an appropriate strategic compromise. So if you have to use proprietary tools to advance FOSS, then you should. Number 12, those with skills and interests in making FOSS friendlier to using AI systems should do so on a matter of high priority. Do not overuse large language model generative AI or allow your skills to atrophy. And this is just like, make sure that you actually work through the motions of programming and keep up your skills. And then think carefully about your usage, number 14. So don't run to generative AI immediately for every problem. And pay attention to the large language model generative AI when it is clearly doing useless processing, and quickly redirect it to do something more useful.